Later, I happened to learn that Victor Gastello had served in the army even before the war. He had been a metal craftsman and instrument maker at a military factory. He loved soccer and played the trumpet in the factory orchestra. He had a combat waiver, but after the death of his older brother he could find no peace and decided to take revenge upon the Germans, and he was killed in action. I waited for someone to tell me the story of the October battle that was now painfully fixed in everyone's memory. Eventually, the time came, and I learned the details of that night from Pasha. "It caught us all by surprise," Pasha said. "It was night, about 4 a.m., when suddenly the air began to tremble, the ground began to quake, and the sky instantly became as light as day from rockets and artillery fire, thousands of gun barrels, simultaneously smashing our front lines. We had never before seen such a show. It was terrible. Soon the German reptiles rose from their trenches, confident that there could be nothing left of us, and they advanced in dense lines. I then came to understand that such close-range fighting can only be called one thing: hell. Only 20 to 25 meters separated us from the Germans, not more, and we repelled them with grenades. Not many in my company survived the battle. Of 46 men, only 3 remained. It was the same in the entire battalion. Now they've withdrawn the battalion to this quiet sector of the front, supposedly to refit and receive reinforcements. But where can they find them? Occasionally they send us 1 or 2 guys. So far it's been quiet here, but our neighbouring units at the old position stayed right there and continue to fight for the city. Either our guys are attacking, and the Germans respond with a storm of fire from fortified buildings and basements, or the Germans counterattack and our guys defend to the death. We now firmly hold 19 city blocks, while other city sectors change from hand to hand. They say that on the 3rd of October, a composite assault group from the 215th Rifle Division and our 220th Rifle Division repulsed 7 counterattacks. Aren't you from the 215th? That's how I learned about the men I now commanded. My first commander's steps were the most simple. I checked the platoon's weapons, and I was delighted to find that it had 2 Dektiari. I divided the platoon into 3 shifts for standing watch in the trenches. I ordered my men, my first order, while on night post, not to spare any ammunition. We had to let the enemy know that he could not catch us unawares, as happened back on that October night, so we had to give him the impression of our defences, alertness and strength. My soldiers replied, "They don't let us shoot more than 5 times a night." I trebled this meagre norm and immediately contacted Battalion Commander Malyashev about the matter. He approved my decision. The next point of business, I decided to work on the trenches, to fix them up and improve them a bit. The trenches, which the remnants of the battalion had entered after the costly September and early October fighting in the city, were in terrible shape. They filled with so much water in the autumn rains that a person could swim along them, and the walls were constantly collapsing. The dugouts, in which we took shelter during German artillery barrages, were no better. They more closely resembled animal burrows. As our first step, we began at night to gather old boards, wood chips, and stouter branches in the forest, and from them we fashioned planking for the bottom of the trench as best we could. Then we gradually strengthened the walls of the trench with beams. We deepened our dugouts and winterized them. To be honest, however, we couldn't handle the construction of a fireplace. It seemed to produce only acrid smoke and soot that filled our dugout when we tried it. At nights we dug dummy and reserve positions. We shifted to our reserve positions during mortar barrages in order to protect ourselves from direct hits. At night I also walked around all our positions, checking on the sentries. So it seemed I never managed to get any sleep at night. If I could, I caught some shut-eye during the daylight hours. After a long night, there rarely seemed to follow any quiet autumn day, when the one sun might make a brief appearance from behind the clouds. On such rare days when the sun came out, we tried to dry out and make ourselves presentable. As the commander, I had to be an example to my men, so I washed, shaved, and diligently cleaned the sticky mud from my field shirt, trousers, overcoat, and boots. It wasn't easy to do all these things in these conditions, but I never deviated from the normal regimen. Things were particularly bad for the men still wearing puttees. They were a constant trouble. But suddenly, one day we started receiving a slow but steady supply of jackboots. Off with the puttees. To be honest, we could see that the boots hadn't come straight from the commissariat. When the boots arrived, we could even see old clots of dried blood on them. No matter, water would clean it all off. A few guys only got boot tops, that's just the way it was. At least they protected the puttees from water and mud. I was suspicious. What kind of supply department would give us boots in such poor condition? It turned out that 2 of our soldiers were crawling out of the trenches into the woods at night and pulling the boots off of dead Germans. This was an unbelievably difficult and dangerous business, and the guys were just trying to help everyone out. The strong Siberian Volodya Gerasimchuk and the nimble young Kyrgyz Tangits Yumatov were doing this work. The operation required a lot of time. The soldiers, who everyone else started calling the searchers for God's gifts, worked through the entire night so that they could return with their booty before first light. They equipped themselves with wire cutters and an extremely sharp garden knife. In order to remove the boot, they often had to cut them off, and sometimes they could only salvage the boot top. Once they returned with the boots and boot tops, they scraped off the mud and other stuff, gave them a good washing and dried them out, then got them back into reasonable shape with the help of thin cords. A complete manufacturing process. The boots were a lifesaver, protecting our feet from the rainwater that always collected at the bottom of the trench. Despite this, many of us were feverish, coughing, and had runny noses, but we didn't pay attention to these little inconveniences. Even so, several soldiers, seriously ill, had to be sent back to the medical sanitation battalion. There was another gift from God that helped us survive. Beginning on September 1st, 1942, frontline soldiers were issued an anesthetic, 100 grams of vodka, roughly half a small mug, which we were told was to warm up. As a general rule, the soldiers who had procured our boots always received an extra few drops of vodka, a double warming, before heading out on a mission for good luck. The rains. The constant rains were maddening. A rare sun would occasionally hang low over the forest like a pale apparition. It grew colder, but starting a fire was impossible in the ceaseless rain and mud, not to mention the proximity of the Germans. In the mornings, if it wasn't raining, there was a dense whitish fog. It hung like a shroud over the trenches and no man's land. At just a few paces, nothing was visible. In these conditions, your mind often began to play tricks on you. We frequently thought we saw German helmets emerging from the fog, and at the slightest rustle we'd react nervously, rifles and grenades at the ready, often firing at imagined targets, simply into the fog. Dreary trench life. The trenches came to life only at night. We'd dispatch the sick and wounded back to the rear, and in return we'd receive our supplies, ammunition, thermoses with food, vodka, mail, and occasionally a reinforcement or 2, usually just 1 or 2 men. The Germans, on the other hand, lived according to a different schedule. They slept in their well-built, warm bunkers at night, then rose at 5 a.m., had breakfast and coffee by 6 a.m., and later entertained themselves by issuing us challenges over a loudspeaker. "Russ, let's fight!" As the days grew shorter, the constant twilight weighed heavily on everyone. The soldiers had grown accustomed to the whistle of passing bullets, the whine of shells, and the howling of dive bombers. But it was evident that everyone was exhausted, their nerves stretched thin. The constant expectation of a strong German attack, one against which we knew we could offer little resistance, seemed to push us into a kind of netherworld. At night, the dampness would seep into your bones. By dawn, your teeth would chatter from the cold. Everything was wet and stinking. The mud was slimy and ever-present underfoot, squelching as you moved. The days were perpetually gloomy. At times, despair would threaten to overcome me, but I tried not to show it in front of my men. What could we do? How could we overcome these dismal moods? We couldn't force nature to be sunny, so we had no choice but to endure, ignoring the stench of the corpses, the rain, and the cold. I asked command to send us the divisional newspaper regularly. but more importantly, I managed to get the platoon withdrawn from the front for one 24-hour period, so we could get cleaned up in a proper bathhouse and get a haircut. I won't even mention the lice. From time to time I'd read to the men, Sholokov, Alexei Tolstoy, Simonov, and if I happened to get my hands on a recent column by Ehrenburg, the men would always ask me to read Our Dear Ilya over and over. In the trenches we tried to outfit our dugouts with some conveniences. We built little stoves out of old iron canisters and milk cans, fashioned low plank beds, and covered them with a dense layer of twigs to serve as mattresses. We dug burrows into the sides of the trench for protection against shell fragments, and equipped them with shelves to hold grenades and cartridges. We cut steps into the slope leading to the firing positions so we could reach them quickly when needed. One of the men had the idea to build a proper bunker, complete with solid cover, a table, benches, and plank beds. Why should we have it any worse than the Germans? We found boards from busted supply carts in the forest, along with some iron clamps. Some men in the rear sent us an axe and hammer. We even located a carpenter, Nikolai Ivanovich. With all these materials we set to work, and indeed we built the bunker. The daily routine days passed in a blur of constant vigilance. We fired at the Germans, repaired communication lines, set up night outposts, and dug ourselves deeper into our dugouts. We tried to maintain army regulations, a common reveille, cleaning of weapons, and training exercises like grenade throwing and target practice with submachine guns. Soon, night would fall, and the order for watch duty would come. The warriors of the platoon. In front-line conditions, if you learn to listen, soldiers will open up to you about things beyond the war. If you engage them in a sincere conversation, they'll gladly share their thoughts, relieved to unburden themselves of their troubles. They'll tell you about their pre-war lives, their families, wives or fiancés, kids and mothers. I quickly learned the names of many mothers and girlfriends. Whenever I had a chance to talk to my soldiers, usually at night, I would ask cordially, "How's Vanya, Natasha, Tanya, Pelageya Ivanovna doing? What is he or she writing?" This conversational style, where I would ask about their loved ones, seemed to me a good way to maintain morale. It helped distract them from the present, if only for a moment, and gave them a dose of optimism. I also needed these talks. One evening, while making my rounds, a soldier from Kostroma greeted me at his post with a smile. "Comrade Commander, what a nice surprise! I got a letter from my dear one." He carefully pulled 2 thin sheets of paper from an envelope and showed them to me. "Look, here's a photo my dear wife sent. My son. He looks just like me, doesn't he? Look how my little one has grown. He'll soon catch up to his father." I nodded in agreement, sharing his joy, although in the darkness I could only imagine his expression. A little further along I came to Trofim Egorich, one of the young recruits. "Have you seen battle yet?" I asked. "And how?" he responded. "I was baptized at Belkovo. I wouldn't wish it on anyone." "Why?" "The thunder of battle was all around. You couldn't hear orders. There was no direction at all. What can you do in a solitary foxhole? The tanks got stuck in the swamp, and we were up to our knees in water. That's how we fought for more than a week until we knocked the Germans out of Belkovo. Only 2 of us survived." He then pulled out a letter and asked, "Can I read you something I just wrote? I'm worried about whether the censors will let it through." I nodded, though it was pitch black. He recited the letter from memory. "Don't think, my dove, that I'll return home alive. The situation here is such that we don't have a chance to be careful, and you know I'm no coward. Look after father. He's already grown feeble. Raise the children well and try to give them an education. Don't hope that I might come back, but without an arm or legs. Don't read my letters to anyone else. Your Trofim Egorich." It was a hard letter to hear. How could a wife read such words? I stayed silent. The soldier was also quiet, breathing heavily. "Thank you for your trust," I said, breaking the silence. "But why are you writing yourself off ahead of time? Fate didn't abandon you at Belkovo, and it won't in the future. As for the censors, you're worrying needlessly." In my mind, I thought to myself, you can rely on a man like this, stubborn, brave, and worthy. Probably that's just nature's way. From that day on, his expression became hard, and he began to pick on me. So why should I build a mansion for him? Nikolai Ivanovich figured out that he couldn't cope with the director and the district swindlers around him. At that time, we didn't know the word mafia. Potapych immediately went off to see his old fishing friend, who headed the local vojenkomat, and asked that he be taken straight away into the Red Army. The military commissar didn't get cold feet and leave Nikolai Ivanovich in the lurch. He managed to get him a military assignment in just 3 days. So Nikolai Ivanovich headed off to serve in a construction battalion. In 1941, he crossed paths with the 220th Rifle Division, which was defending Vitebsk at the time. From then on, Potapov fought in the 673rd Rifle Regiment. As a construction foreman, Nikolai Ivanovich was excellent. Employing just one assistant, he built our bunker in 4 days without using a single nail, working only with a saw and hammer. They made the bunker from half-grown trees, felled with axes, and gave it a planked roof covered by a thick layer of sod. The entrance was draped with a canvas sheet. Potapych made the passage to the bunker at an angle to ward off shell fragments. Inside, he built a small table and several stove couches, one of which he offered to me. Nikolai Ivanovich also turned out to be a creative stove maker. He built an excellent little stove for the bunker from a milk can, attaching a nearly invisible chimney. Of course, what we had was far from a real bunker, but we all proudly called it that. The completion of its construction was a real holiday for us. The bunker became our common home, where each man could catch his breath from the trench's stench and mud, write a letter to a loved one, have a leisurely meal, read the divisional newspaper, or change his boots. I also placed my signalman with the telephone inside for constant communication with our neighbours and the battalion. We were all happy to have another great talent in the platoon, a gifted singer, the Ukrainian Vasil Badulia. The entire platoon knew his story. Vasil lived in Kanev, the town where the national Ukrainian poet Taras Shevchenko is buried. A year before the war, Vasil travelled to Kiev, went straight to the Academic Opera Theatre, and presented himself to the chief producer. There, with no ceremony, he announced, "I want to sing on your stage. Will you listen to me?" The producer, dumbstruck, agreed to hear him sing. Vasil performed an aria from Rigoletto and 2 folk songs. Afterward, the producer embraced him and invited him to come to a rehearsal, saying, "I want to introduce the troupe to the Ukrainian Lemeshev." Overjoyed, Vasil danced along the way to a dock on the Dnieper River, took the next steamboat back to Kanev, and dreamed of a future in the best theatres of the country, performing alongside the likes of Lemeshev and Kozlovsky. However, his meeting with Olesia did not go as he expected. She didn't express joy at the news. On the contrary, she said, as only a cruel lover can, "It's either me or the theatre." Vasil chose his sobbing girlfriend over the theatre, believing the theatre, and his voice, would still be there. The war soon erased all his hopes. Having heard the story from its protagonist, everyone gave Vasil a scolding, and even more futilely, to his Olesia. Only one soldier, the short, stocky Sasha Pchelkin from near Saratov, refused to join in. "Thanks to Olesia! Without her intervention, we would never have had the chance to hear the front-line Lemeshev." Pchelkin's opinion prompted general agreement and laughter. I still remember Vasil Badulia's favourite song. The night is so moonlit, serene and starlit, that you can even pick up a needle in the grass. Come out, my beloved, and if, exhausted by work, come out if only for a short minute. To listen to Vasil Badulia's singing was a great pleasure. His voice brightened our dreary existence in the trenches, transported us back to normal life for a time, and lifted our spirits. Vasil loved to sing a song about the Dnieper, but I can only recall a few lines. "O Dnieper, Dnieper, you are wide and powerful, but your waters are like a stream of tears." Each day brought a new concert. What didn't we hear him sing? Sometimes I even forgot there was shooting nearby, that any moment might be my last. Before the war, though we lived in Moscow, I had never once attended the Bolshoi Theatre. I wasn't much drawn to vocal music, but the singing of Vasil in this unusual trench setting was a miracle, and this miracle inspired in me, the first time ever, a deep thirst to hear more marvellous melodies. I promised myself that if I survived, I would visit the Bolshoi. And, I thought, how wonderful it would be to see Vasil on that stage. But fate had other plans. Vasil was generous. He often repeated his repertoire for those who missed his performances due to watch duty. He became everyone's favourite. We all tried to protect him from the dampness, the cold, and German bullets. Some gave him their best boots, others a muffler, and we made sure he had warm tea. We even wrote about him in our letters home, proud to have him with us in the trenches. I often called the battalion, asking them to relay word about the gifted singer to the regiment commander and commissar. I wanted them to assign him to the army's performing ensemble. Malyashev agreed with me, but for some reason nothing ever came of it. Once the Germans contacted us by radio. "What have you done with your singer?" For several days our artist had been sick. Someone remembered that during Vasil Badulia's performances, firing between the lines ceased. Days later, the Germans surprised us by sneaking into no man's land and tossing a harmonica toward our position. Someone crawled out to retrieve it and gave it to Vasil. In late October, tragedy struck. A German sniper silenced Vasil's voice forever. This tragic episode taught me a lesson. We often put things off for tomorrow, but in war, as in life, tomorrow may never come. Fighting in the city gradually subsided. The summer-autumn offensive had come to an end. Unexpectedly, Malyashev called me. "You're leaving your platoon command. By order of the army, cadets who didn't complete their training are being sent to the Tashkent Combat Infantry School. Turn over your platoon command and march with your things to the regiment. We'll take Rzhev. We'll break through to Berlin, and you, Sergeant, will catch up with us somewhere. Don't forget to bring a big juicy melon and more wine." I didn't believe in the trip to Tashkent. Was this a mistake? Nonetheless, I did as I was ordered. I turned over my platoon to my deputy, Sergeant Pasha Ivanov, said farewell to everyone, and thanked them for their outstanding service. I gave away my greatcoat and warm socks, not thinking I'd need them in the south. I put on a padded jacket, and once darkness fell, I crawled, occasionally dashing, toward regimental headquarters. Once I arrived, I handed over my orders. The young colonel who took them chuckled and said, "Congratulations on graduating from Tashkent Combat Infantry School and on receiving the rank of junior lieutenant. Excuse me, there's been a mix-up and they haven't prepared documents for you to return to your division. We'll drive you back ourselves." It all turned out amusingly. I didn't know whether to be happier about my officer rank or the fact I had thwarted the trip to Tashkent. Honestly, I wasn't longing for more training. I still had little but real combat experience. But thinking of my platoon, I felt a warm feeling inside, and that night, after returning to the trenches, I reported to Malyashev, "I graduated from military school in 24 hours, and now I'm a junior lieutenant." The soldiers greeted me with friendly laughter. From Kobilkino I had brought a fresh issue of the army newspaper with verses by Surkov, written at Rzhev. I immediately read them aloud to the gathered warriors. The shell fragments are beginning to howl like wolves across the uncomfortable expanse of this unharvested field. But when the cannonade falls silent for a minute, you can hear the sad cry of cranes in the sky. We all enjoyed the poem, but Pasha pulled out an envelope. "I have some news for you," he said. "They brought the mail the morning after you left. Here's a letter from home. I saved it just in case you might send us your new address." The delight that washed over me was indescribable. Mother's first letter. 5 months had passed since I had last seen her, when we said goodbye in Tiumen. This was the first letter I had received at the front. I read it 3 times, then reread it for hours. After many uneasy days, I finally received your letters. The first one hadn't even arrived when the mail carrier brought 2 more. What a fine fellow you are. I recalled how, in your childhood, you loved making little paper ships out of these same paper triangles. You set them afloat in the largest puddles, creating entire naval battles. One of your friends, I don't recall who, predicted you would become a sailor. If only you knew how many times I read your letters. I wept and became overjoyed that you were alive. And I laughed. You haven't lost your sense of humour at the front. You particularly amused me with the story of your first frontline meal, the tastiest soup in your entire life, and how you got the fish head, and how everyone who tried the soup called you the best cook. A rainy autumn, I implore you, take care of yourself. Keep your neck covered with the muffler, keep your feet warm, don't drink untreated water, and don't eat anything cold. How you loved it whenever I fixed meat patties, and especially the potato pancakes. Find out from your commanders if it is permissible, and I'll fix potato pancakes for your entire army and send them to the front. Write, my little one, whenever you can. Do you have friends, and is your officer a good one? That's so important, especially at the front. I'm kissing you. Your Mama. My dear, sweet, marvellous Mama. It is such a pity that Iurka isn't with me any longer. I would have read him the letter absolutely, and I'm sure he would have shared in my happiness. A combat operation with regimental scouts, I hadn't yet had time to slake my thirst for reading Mama's letter, when the battalion commander called me and told me to report immediately. I set off for his command post. Malishev was brief. Tomorrow night we'll be sending you some regiment scouts and sappers. Headquarters needs a tongue. A living prisoner of war who is willing to talk. We're supposed to cover them. Pick 5 soldiers with 2 machine guns. You'll lead the operation personally. If you happen to need it, we'll support you with mortars and artillery. Returning to the trenches, I immediately called the platoon together. I explained the given assignment and asked, "Who's going with me?" Everyone was quiet. I calmly waited for a reply. The first to speak up, just think, was Mavrai. "I'll go," his voice rang out confidently. 7 more men spoke up after him. I chose 5. Mavri, the experienced fighters Volodya Gerasimchuk and Tangits Yumatov, and 2 machine gunners. One had been living in an orphanage before the war, a fine fellow. In the platoon everybody called him the Kazan orphan. The other was 19-year-old Sergei, one of the guys from Ryazan, who loved the old storyteller's standard introduction. In Ryazan we have mushrooms with eyes. At some point he had told me that he had a fiancée who was waiting for him back home. At the start of the operation, the scouts showed up. Like us, there were 6 of them, led by a Lieutenant Pavel Chernov. "Why did you choose this sector of the front?" I immediately asked their commander. "There are 3 things in our favour here," said the lieutenant. "The bunker that we've targeted has weak security, practically just a single sentry. Secondly, to the right of the bunker is a pretty large swamp, and to the left of it some hilly terrain. Thirdly, about 20 paces from the bunker, the German trench line takes a sharp turn, which is good for us. At this turn there is a second sentry. He leaves this turn every 11 minutes and returns after about the same interval of time. Moreover, every 30 minutes a patrol checks this sector of the line. 2 soldiers and an Unteroffizier, a German rank equivalent to a sergeant. But we don't have to reckon with them, as we should be able to manage everything in the 11 minutes before the second sentry returns." "And our job?" "Your main job is to give cover as we withdraw with our tongue. I'll describe the plan to you. We'll all leave together. When we're in sight of the German trench, we'll move on ahead, while you separate into 2 groups, move about 70 meters from each other, set up in your positions and wait for our return. We'll do our job and then start to withdraw. Next is the most difficult part of the mission. After 5 or 6 minutes, the second sentry will spot the corpses and recognize that one of his guys is missing. He'll raise the alarm, and the Germans will immediately try to recover their missing guy, dead or alive. The important thing is to not let the Fritzes leave their trenches. Open fire at the slightest movement. Our group with the prisoner will pass your right-hand position, which should have the commander in it. That's you. As soon as you see us, you'll start giving us cover. Meanwhile, I'll be moving over to your left-hand position, and your guys will cover our exit. As soon as I reach them, I'll give you a signal, and we'll all pull back to our trenches. If the Fritzes manage to encircle us, Neither our guys nor your guys will get out. They, the swine, know how to punish us whenever we screw up. That means the outcome of the operation depends upon our full cooperation. But how will you grab a tongue?" The lieutenant smiled. "Our job has been arranged. Our group will make its way up to the first trenches, where it will also split up. 3 of us, I and 2 others, having waited for the patrol and the second sentry to pass, will climb into the trench, take care of the first sentry by the bunker, and then seize a warm and snug Fritz. The other 3 men will be covering the turn in the trench line and watching for the second sentry. We'll make our way to them with our prisoner, hand him up to them out of the trench, and they'll head to the rear. We'll cover their departure and then also move back. That's all. The most unpredictable part is the return with the prisoner, and this is where, in fact, you'll help us." The lieutenant introduced his hunters to us, as the scouts liked to call themselves. "This is our soldier Petya," and he wrapped his arm around a short, round-faced adolescent. "He's 18. He's already tallied 2 tongues. He has the Order of the Red Banner. He's always in our snatch group whenever we go on a hunt. The guy has unbelievably sharp eyes, like a lynx, and he knows how to handle the cold steel like an expert, not a single spare motion." Next to Petya, a broad-shouldered Ukrainian named Mikola, an enormous and powerful fellow, was standing like a cast-iron monolith, looking at me with his pale blue eyes and smiling like a child. He said only one thing: "We'll get it done," as if to comfort us. The third scout, Andrei, was also powerfully built. He was 19. Presenting him to us, the lieutenant said, "He once dragged in 2 prisoners at the same time, Hans on one shoulder, Otto on the other. Quite the guy. It's just that he's got a lot of arrogance too, and that's Shurik." Lieutenant Chernov nodded over at a tall, well-built fellow with a lush head of hair. "He can shoot with his eyes closed. He's the favourite of all the regiment's girls." The 5th hunter was Seaman, who had a rough, weathered face. "He ought to be a boxer," the lieutenant proudly said. "From his looks alone, the opponent will crash to the canvas, but at the front this fellow stays busy catching babes, as he likes to call it." I spent some time with the scouts, about 2 hours, and we looked at them with admiration. We were in the presence of uncommon people. They were all well-groomed and cleanly shaven. Their commander, Lieutenant Pavel Chernov, led them by a strict rule. For those in reconnaissance, only a neat appearance. I didn't notice any posturing in any of them, and they were simply uniformed, quilted trousers, boots, and padded jackets without any shoulder straps. Each man was armed with a pistol, grenades, and a knife. Looking at them, it was hard to believe that they were facing mortal danger. There was no sign of any tension on their faces or in their eyes, much less any fear or indecision, or any fidgeting. They laughed, talked about everything under the sun, and cracked jokes. Only no one said a single word about the upcoming operation. It seemed we were more afraid for them than they were for themselves. Where did they find such energetic, active, and strong men? The sappers returned and reported that they had cleared a path to the German trenches. At 2:30 in the morning, I contacted the battalion commander and said everything was ready, and received a good luck in return on our departure. We jumped across the trenches and then crawled after the scouts. Everything seemed like it was in a dream. At first, in the darkness, I lost sight of the lead group, but I still managed to make do. Soon we caught up with the scouts at our covering position, and they moved on ahead. My group split up and moved apart to the predetermined distance. I kept Volodya Gerasimchuk and the orphan machine gunner in my group. Mavry and Tangits Yumatov were with the second machine gunner Sergei. The Germans were so confident in their invulnerability that they hadn't set any trip flares or other detection devices out in front of their lines, so for the time being everything was going smoothly. I was worried how the scouts would make their way across the zone directly in front of their trenches, because the Germans were continually sending up illumination flares. But everything was quiet in their direction. The Germans periodically opened up with short machine gun bursts and automatic fire, and we could hear the bullets whistling overhead. What sort of nighttime show was this? As someone explained to me later, this area fire was for psychological effect, as if to let you know they've spotted you. The silvery light of a multitude of flares, penetrating through the damp gloom of the night, was illuminating a fairly broad expanse. The scouts were out there somewhere, but they were moving so skillfully that the Germans didn't detect them. Afterward, the lieutenant told me how it all went down. Seaman, the boxer, and the soldier Petier took down the sentry by the bunker in the space of 14 seconds. Then the three of them burst into the bunker. After a minute, they dragged a half-asleep, frightened German, still in his underwear, with hands bound and mouth gagged, out into the trench. They tossed him like a rag doll up into the hands of the covering group. They quickly wrapped the prisoner in a canvas tent sheet and dragged him away. All this took 6 minutes. The second sentry, having discovered the body of his partner and 2 more dead in the bunker, fired into the air and ran to meet the approaching patrol. We heard all of this, but we couldn't see anything. A few isolated bursts of automatic fire rang out. We could hear loud commands and the trampling of boots. After a minute, alarm signals started sounding and spread along the entire German defensive line. Suddenly, the shooting died away. Clearly, I thought to myself, the Germans are getting ready to go after our guys. At that moment, German helmets appeared above the breastworks and grenades started flying after our scouts. Not waiting for the Germans to leave their trenches, I gave the command to open fire. Both of our Degtiari opened up. The helmets quickly dropped out of sight. Now the entire German front line began to bristle against us. Machine guns began to chatter up and down the line. The scouts passed by us, quickly crawling back to our lines with their booty. A short time later, I heard the agreed-upon signal from Lieutenant Chernov and gave the order to withdraw. It was difficult to foresee what happened next. Evidently the Germans had spotted my second group and directed aimed mortar fire upon it. Machine gunner Sergei Vadovin was the first to die. Shell fragments struck Andrei in the leg. He himself managed to bind the wound and started crawling farther. The next shell exploded quite close to Lieutenant Chernov, and here an astonishing thing happened. Mavry, who at that moment was next to Chernov, flung himself upon the lieutenant and covered him with his body. Torn by fragments and covered with blood, Mavry was dead. Having noticed a small gully nearby, the lieutenant gathered the survivors in it. Here they waited out the mortar barrage, and then, bringing the 2 dead men with them, they started crawling back to our entrenchments. Our group, meanwhile, was withdrawing quietly and without interference, for the ground over which we were moving was wrapped in pre-dawn mists. Although the fog covered our withdrawal, it did me a bad turn. To my misfortune, I didn't notice a deep shell hole filled with water and fell down into it. In the darkness, no one else noticed what had happened, and I remained alone in my icy basin. I began to flounder desperately, trying to clamber up the slippery wall of the hole, but I kept slipping back down into the icy water. Again and again, exhausting my strength, I tried to extricate myself, but my frozen body stopped responding, my legs cramped up, and I realized with despair that I could not get out by myself, and my comrades had moved on. Suddenly I felt a bump, and a pair of strong, extended hands grabbed hold of me. Volodya Gerasimchuk. With his help, I finally clambered out. Exhausted, wet, covered by sticky, stinking mud, I lay down on the ground, listening to the explosion of shells, trying to come back to my senses. The trenches were quite nearby, but the guys had stopped, waiting for me. When I had gathered my strength, the soldier asked if we could move on. Shaking, teeth chattering, I could barely crawl. Just then, our own artillery opened return fire. The German fire paused briefly, and we took advantage of this to rush back into our lines. Thus we were all saved. I phoned the battalion commander, reported the situation, and asked him to send some litter-bearers immediately. I heard only one word in response: turd. After that, I considered the battalion commander to be worthless. The next night, they buried Mavry and Sergei Vadovin. The day before, Malishev had called, "You're going to have guests. They're coming to bury your hero." An esteemed group showed up to say farewell to Mavry. It included the regiment commander Glukov and his adjutant, the battalion commander, the scouts with their commander, Lieutenant Pavel Chernov, and Vasily Soshnev, a correspondent on the staff of the divisional newspaper for the motherland. Overnight, Potapitch made a coffin from boards he removed from the roof of our bunker. We laid Mavri in it, not forgetting his little cross, which he had kept intact. The stern scout commander started crying when he saw the body of Mavri, who had given his life to save him. One time, Mavri had said, "The soul of a man is full of kindness. Who can forbid him to give it for another man?" This man had given everything he could. Deep sorrow possessed us all. The regiment commander, having removed his forage cap, spoke the first words. In the silence of the night, he spoke very solemnly. "The saving of a commander by a soldier has always in the history of the army been considered a heroic deed," he said. "If you will, it is no less in our time than the ramming of a tank or an airplane, or when a soldier flings himself upon the firing slit of a pillbox to block the machine-gun fire from within. We have sent a recommendation to the division to award this soldier the title Hero of the Soviet Union." Lieutenant Chernov kissed Mavri on the cheek and uttered only 3 words. "Thank you, friend." I spoke last, my eyes brimming with tears, but I gathered myself and said, "Mavri's act was not an unreasonable, reckless act. He believed in God, and the feeling of high duty to other people was fully developed inside this man. He held his military obligations to be sacred, and for this God shows his gratitude." Malyshev, who was standing next to me, glanced at me spitefully. The regiment commander shook my hand and thanked me for Mavri. I warmly parted with the scout lieutenant and his men. Pavel Chernov embraced me in farewell. "Thank you for the support. If you ever need it, give me a call. My guys and I will always give you help." The correspondent Vasily Soshnev approached me. "What a story for the divisional newspaper. It's a real windfall, an example for many other religious soldiers. We have a lot of them. Although men like Mavri, there aren't many, of course, I'm confident that the party leadership will welcome this story." I interrupted him. "I ask only that you don't make an atheist of him. In that case, nobody will believe in the truth of what you've written, and you will offend the memory of this man." We talked for a long time. Vasily wanted to know more details about Mavri, and I wanted to talk about him, our first meeting, his attitude toward war, toward people, and that Mavri was only 19. He fought for all of 150 days. But neither one thing nor the other prevented him from becoming a real soldier. At critical moments in a man's life, the instincts laid down in him through his mother's milk emerge, and in Mavri these instincts were strengthened by family traditions and faith, about which he liked to say, "It's not important what a person believes in, just his faith itself is important." We are all connected with life by many threads, and nobody wants to die. Then suddenly, with a bright flash, this precious life itself poses you a question. Are you prepared to sacrifice yourself? It is difficult to say how a person will behave in this situation. Mavri's action was truly a heroic feat. The true strength of a very religious person consists in the unselfishness of the good work he or she has done, even if he is not confident that he will be rewarded for this in the next world. That's how Mavri always thought and behaved. The article in the divisional newspaper closed with these words. Soshnev kept his promise. Mavri's deed made a strong impression on me and stirred me up inside. It raised many complicated thoughts and feelings. No, I didn't become a religious person, but unquestionably this act had an influence on my soul. I began to study believers more attentively. There were a lot of them among the soldiers, and I tried to understand them better and treat them with respect. If the need arose, I tried to help them. Vasya Soshnev, the correspondent, was about 4 years older than me. He turned out to be a surprisingly pleasant and tactful man. I liked him, and we became friends from that night on. We corresponded after the war, when he continued to serve in the army. We met in Moscow on the 30th anniversary of Victory Day, by which time Vasily Stepanovich Soshnev had become a major general. At this meeting, the veterans chose him to be the chairman of the Council of Veterans of the 220th Rifle Division. Together we travelled to Ilets in 1981 for the 40th anniversary of the division's founding. Together we escorted veterans on their final journey, and every year we marked Victory Day together beneath the combat banner of the division. The Central Museum of the Soviet Army had returned this banner to us one day. My heart has kept a good memory of this post-war period and my lively reunions with my brother soldiers. I've also kept rare photographs. Where will they go after me, and who will be interested in them? The Germans missed their Gefreiter, the German rank equivalent to a corporal. Anticipating some unpleasantness, after talking things over with the battalion commander, I split my platoon into 2 groups. As a security detail for the first line of trenches, I left 4 soldiers, and with the rest, I pulled back into reserve positions. Actually, 2 days hadn't even passed when the Germans decided to get even with us in revenge for their helplessness, their dead, and their captured Gefreiter. They brought down a storm of artillery fire on our front-line position, 5 artillery barrages in the course of one day. That night we returned to our old entrenchments. Now there were only enormous piles of earth, rocks, and fragments of our thoroughly blasted bunker, and bodies. All 4 of my men had been killed. We had to dig out Pasha Ivanov's body. Pasha! Mavri! Sergei! So many human tragedies at once. How can one endure such a thing? Perhaps this was my fault. But what if the Germans had counterattacked? No, one must not do without a security detail. The damned swine! Why are they here? Why have they come for us? One after the other, the war is devouring the very best, the kindest, the strongest, the youngest. So I wanted to cry out and ask, why, God? Oh, Pasha, Pasha, so you never became the platoon commander, and it has all led to this. I never asked him about his stuttering, but he once himself told me how it started. Pavel grew up in a military family. They lived in Kuibyshev, in a military sector of the city. His father was a dashing cavalier who commanded a squadron. He often took his 7-year-old son, placed him on the saddle in front of him, and at a gallop they would ride around the training field with the young boy breathless with delight. Once the squadron commander flushed after a bottle. Several days later, an order rang out from the regiment commander, Glukov. A reconnaissance in force. The operation fell to our battalion. I had already heard so many tragic stories about these operations, which in Russian were known as reconnaissance through combat, Razvedka Boem. How highly the commanders believed in them and valued them, and with what horror did the soldiers utter this phrase. Rare was the soldier who remained alive after such an assignment, and it was considered a success if you were just wounded and your own guys managed to drag you off the battlefield. Malyashev summoned his subordinate officers. At night, 2 platoons will advance to within 50 or 70 meters of the line of defense. At a signal, we'll create a big racket, machine guns, automatic weapons, grenades, and then the platoons will bound forward and try to break into the enemy's trenches. The operation will start at 5:30. The signal will be a green rocket. Sappers will clear narrow passages through the minefield. Of course, we were lucky to have the help of the sappers, but everyone knew that in such situations the first lines would inevitably suffer great losses from undetected mines, and by this sacrifice they would clear the way for those following. Even at that time, I understood that reconnaissance through combat was the brainstorm of the Supreme Commander and his generals. Depending upon the task, they would send a platoon, a company, or a battalion. The size of the force didn't matter. In reality, they were driving people to their slaughter, to their certain death. The point of the operation, as they considered it at headquarters, was to give the enemy a big scare so that he might think a large-scale offensive was beginning and cause him to open fire from all his positions, thereby revealing them to our intelligence. Subsequently, we could easily knock them out. In practice, things rarely turned out that way. In reality, reconnaissance through combat was complete hogwash. The most it might do would be to give us more precise information on the layout of the enemy's forward positions. Given a deeply echeloned defence, even this couldn't achieve the permanent elimination of firing positions. Moreover, to count upon the complete suppression of the enemy's weapon emplacements during the attack was complete nonsense. The Germans, incidentally, as did we, quickly saw through these simple schemes. Meanwhile, a reconnaissance through combat primarily just devoured men, just like Moloch, a god of the Ammonites and Phoenicians that demanded human sacrifice. And when the fighting started, the enemy's weapons usually came to life, and our infantry, striving for the enemy's positions, poured out their blood. The war ended, years passed, but this idiotic idea, which cannot be called anything else, continued to live on in the minds of generals. When they were testing the atomic bomb, they implemented the same type of reconnaissance in its atomic form, and sent thousands of officers and soldiers, infantry, tanks, artillery, and cavalry, to the test site. Yes, the people were dressed in protective suits, but once again they were checking, on people, the suit's effectiveness against radiation. They used the people just like laboratory mice. They warmed us up a bit before the operation, dressed us in white smocks for camouflage, and gave us each a shot of vodka, a loaf of bread for two, and some tasty soup with meat and noodles in it. After midnight, we very quietly clambered out of our trenches, slowly crawled up to the designated line, and taking cover behind sparse snow-covered shrubs and folds in the ground, pressed ourselves to the earth. We merged with the cold, frozen ground, but for us, on this night, there was nothing more comfortable and reliable. Above no man's land, flares burst into light and quickly died out. A pale moon occasionally peeked out from behind the clouds and cast a soft glow across the shallow, glittering snow. Soon, as if to aid our concealment, the clouds cloaked the night sky, and it grew darker. The Germans were quiet. They hadn't spotted us. Time passed slowly. From time to time I glanced at my watch and tried not to think about anything. But my brain worked of its own accord. How would it happen? What would it be like? The last moment of my still young life? Would my soldiers get up to follow me, just to have their lives snuffed out forever a minute later? I had just reached 20 years of age, but on that night I thought about and pitied not so much myself, but my mother, my dear, loving, devotedly waiting mother. There were 16 of us in the platoon. The 17th had gone the day before to the medicine bat with boils. Likely all 16 of us were now envying him. A young Tatar was lying next to me, very quietly mumbling something, either praying or, like me, whispering about something to his mother. Beyond him, the barely audible sounds of an Uzbek carried to my ears. 127, 128. Apparently he was playing some game unknown to me, or trying to guess at something. Perhaps I should also be trying to predict something. Here, if I catch sight of a star before the attack, it will mean that everything will go all right for my soldiers and me. Now I was not only watching the hands on my watch, but also constantly glancing at the sky, still covered by a thick blanket of clouds. A half-hour remained until the signal rocket, a half-hour of life for each of us, the sons of mothers. There were also wives and children to consider. One of us, a Belarusian, had 5 kids already. Now the minutes roll by at a gallop. I give the hand signal to get ready. I have faith in my men, and they believe in me. A few minutes more. My nerves stretched to the breaking point. I've already laid my submachine gun in front of me. An unpleasant shiver of fear passes down my entire body. For the first time, I feel that I'm absolutely frozen. I try to shrink inside myself, straighten my shoulders. Tugging at my greatcoat beneath the camouflage smock, I tighten up my belt another notch. That seems to help. Already the night seems not as cold and frightening. I try to prepare myself for the difficult minute that lay ahead. I try to forget about the cold, the whistle of bullets, about my possible death, and I force myself to think about the future, about everything pleasant and joyful, about meetings that would still take place somewhere in my future. I glance up at the sky again, and I forget about everything. A star is twinkling above me. My omen. It is solitary and pale, but such a long-awaited and surprisingly precious star. To this day, I try to understand it, and I cannot answer the question. Did that star really exist, or was it a figment of my imagination? But a fact remains a fact. Precisely at 5:30, a command passed down the line in a whisper. Fall back. We quietly crawled back to our entrenchments. Should we believe in fate? I believe. Within several days we learned that our units were shifting positions, and the movement had already begun. Until the end of 1942, a relative calm fell around the city of Rzhev itself. At the same time, I learned that I was receiving a promotion to company commander, in which position I would immediately have to wrestle with a grave threat facing the Red Army: desertion. Desertion, a deliberate, voluntary abandonment of a military unit by military servicemen, one of the gravest crimes against military service. Military Encyclopedic Dictionary, Volume 1, Moscow, Ripoll Classic, 2001. In the middle of November 1942, the 673rd Rifle Regiment, or more accurately its remnants, was transferred to the left bank of the Volga River, which had been fully liberated from the Germans in the summer. Here, on defence, the regiment sat until March 1943. We took position in the Germans' former trenches. They were quite spacious and had been constructed according to all the rules of engineering science. Every bunker had a table, comfortable bunks, and a stove. As became clear later, these stoves had been manufactured in Rzhev in workshops that had been established by the occupiers. The Germans also organised the manufacture of mines and bombs in the city. The enemy was dug in on the opposite bank of the river. Only the Volga separated our two lines. Right away, incidents of desertion became much more frequent. The subject of desertion in the Red Army has long awaited special investigation. The conviction is widespread that our people, from the very first days of the war, never lost hope in ultimate victory. That isn't so. In actuality, confidence in victory over the enemy began appearing only in 1943, after the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk. The constant heavy defeats of the Red Army in 1941, 1942, the enormous human losses, led a portion of the Soviet people to lose hope of success. In 1942, as in 1941, desertion from the Red Army was still massive. Many deserting soldiers didn't consider their action a betrayal. For them, the pre-war reality in the country did not serve as an ideal for which they should die. In fleeing, they saw the single means to escape the Stalinist system of slavery, naively believing that the Germans, having defeated the Soviet Union, would destroy the Soviet regime and make them free and happy. Of course, all these people were also trying to save their own lives. Along the entire front in 1942, 1,200 men went over to the German side daily, which meant around 6,000 men a month. Looking at it another way, this meant the Red Army was losing almost an entire division on a monthly basis. At that time, as a result of losses that could not be replaced, as a rule, a division in the Red Army was considered to have around 6,000 soldiers. Desertions swept through the ranks of the Western Front near Rzhev as well. Naturally, they happened in our 220th Rifle Division too. In the first stage of the war, our propaganda primarily stigmatized Hitler and his comrades in arms. However, as the war progressed, it turned its focus to the new order that the Hitlerites were propagating in the occupied territories. At the same time, steps were taken to improve the daily lives of the soldiers. We began to receive better food, bathhouses were constructed, and we were given more opportunities to wash ourselves. Despite these improvements, flights to the German lines continued. An aside, desertion and turncoats. Historically, the Russian army, dating back to Peter the Great, used the term deserter to describe a serviceman who went over to the enemy. However, in the Soviet army, especially during the Great Patriotic War, the term for the Soviet struggle on the Eastern Front in World War II, the term was replaced by perebezhchik, turncoat. This shift occurred because the words deserter and desertion were seen as deeply frightening by Soviet officials. The scale of mass desertions was indeed painful to behold. Official records indicate that from 1942 onwards, more than 500,000 individuals deserted from the ranks of the Red Army. The data, though, are likely an underestimation. It is well known that over 1 million Soviet citizens, dressed in German uniforms, served in the German forces on the Eastern Front. These individuals were largely in the rear, performing tasks like supply, construction and security behind the German front lines. From autumn 1941, many German commanders began creating auxiliary units from deserters, prisoners, and volunteers from the occupied regions. These units were initially called Our Ivans, but were later officially named Hilfswilliger, those wanting to help, abbreviated to Hiwis. The Germans employed the Hiwis as security personnel, drivers, labourers, and loaders. The success of this experiment exceeded German expectations. By spring 1942, over 200,000 Hiwis were serving in the German army's rear units, and by the end of the year, their number had grown to around 1 million. During the Battle of Stalingrad in November 1942, Paulus's Sixth Army included nearly 52,000 Hiwis. At Kursk in the summer of 1943, Russians, as the Germans called all Soviet citizens, made up 5 to 8% of the troops in elite SS divisions. The Germans also created Eastern legions composed of non-Russian citizens of the USSR, such as the Turkestan, Kavkaz, Armenian, Volgo-Tatar, and Kalmyk legions. The Cossacks were particularly favoured by the Germans, with over 250,000 joining their ranks. However, Hitler's pathological hatred of Russians, many of whom wanted to fight against Soviet rule, may have contributed to his eventual defeat against the USSR. By the end of the Great Patriotic War, the total number of desertions from the Red Army had reached 588,400. During the same period, 994,300 servicemen were convicted for attempting to desert. Of these, 422,700 were sent to penal battalions, 436,300 to concentration camps, and 150,000 were executed. Our division stood on defence on the left bank of the Volga, no more than 200 metres from the German positions. The proximity to the enemy gave rise to a new wave of desertions, with soldiers fleeing in ones, twos, and in entire groups. The act of desertion was a complex psychological matter, as it required soldiers to overcome the fear and difficulties of crossing enemy lines under perilous conditions. The desertion process involved sneaking out of one's trench, crossing the icy river, avoiding German machine guns and snipers, and navigating through a minefield to reach the enemy's side. The Germans had prepared for this, clearing narrow paths through their minefields and marking them with signs that indicated where deserters could safely cross. German propaganda and desertion attempts. Every evening, loudspeakers would crackle, and former Red Army soldiers, who had fled to the Germans, would broadcast messages to their comrades on the Soviet side. These broadcasts included appeals from deserters, who spoke about how well they were treated by the Germans, how they were given food like French chocolate, Dutch cheese, and Danish ham, and how they were promised a return to their villages. Initially, the Soviet artillery would try to block these desertions by firing at the ice on the river, but the Germans would quickly relocate their loudspeakers to new positions, continuing their propaganda efforts. Despite the artillery efforts, many soldiers listened attentively to these broadcasts, some of them growing disillusioned with their current situation. Attempts to curb desertions. In an attempt to combat desertion, some higher-ups in the Soviet military suggested inspecting soldiers' personal effects for German leaflets, which they believed might curtail the number of escapes. However, the author rejected this idea, seeing it as both impractical and counterproductive. He believed such inspections would breed distrust between commanders and soldiers, undermining morale. One night, after an alarm was raised due to 3 soldiers attempting to desert simultaneously, the company commander ordered a pursuit. However, the Germans opened fire with machine guns from 2 directions, wounding 2 Soviet soldiers. Despite this, the deserters successfully made it across to the German lines. The company commander and platoon lieutenant were later relieved of their duties and sent to penal battalions. As a new company commander, the author faced the challenge of preventing desertions within his own unit. To minimize the opportunity for escape, he divided his company into 2 shifts, day and night, and set up 12 posts along their sector of the front. Each post had 2 soldiers on guard, with only short breaks in between shifts. The company commander and his deputy made regular checks on the posts, ensuring that soldiers were not leaving their positions. Additionally, the commander carefully paired soldiers from different backgrounds, such as those from occupied regions with those from unoccupied areas, to discourage desertion attempts. Active defence measures were also put in place, with soldiers ordered to fire at the slightest movement from the enemy. The system worked. For nearly a month, there were no desertions from the company, a remarkable success compared to the neighbouring units. Division Commissar Borisov. One evening, the battalion commander, Malyshev, brought the division commissar, Leonid Fedorovich Borisov, to the company. Borisov was a well-known figure, respected by the soldiers for his presence at the front and his role in organising partisan movements. He had been instrumental in rallying disorganised retreating units in 1941 and delaying the German advance. Borisov's arrival at the company was a significant event, as commissars typically avoided the front lines. Upon arrival, he requested a cup of strong tea, which the soldiers brewed for him. His visit boosted morale and reinforced the importance of maintaining discipline and loyalty among the troops. Then we left to tour the trenches. I introduced him to the soldiers, confident that he would make a strong impression on them. Tall, broad-shouldered, and relatively young, Borisov was slightly nearsighted. Behind his glasses were lively, experienced eyes. He often removed his glasses and wiped them with a handkerchief, out of habit. The commissar exchanged friendly greetings with each soldier and asked them questions. How was he being fed? Did he have access to a bathhouse? Was he receiving letters from home? Borisov also spent some time in the dugouts. He was happy when he spotted several recent issues of the divisional newspaper on a table in one of them. In another dugout, the relaxing soldiers were engaged in a card game when the officers and commissar entered. The battalion commander's face twisted into a frightening grimace as he ducked into the dugout behind the commissar. The card players instantly flew into a flurry of action, trying to conceal their cards. Leonid Fedorovich broke into laughter. "It's a pity we don't have more time, or else I would join you in your game. I haven't held cards in my hands in a long time. In my old units, where I served before the war, we loved to break out the cards in the evening." The battalion commander relaxed, and the soldiers started smiling. Borisov asked them not to be timid and to ask any questions that were on their minds. "Why aren't the Germans dissolving the collective farms?" The first question rang out. "Does this mean they're also for the collective farm system?" Borisov answered, "Not quite. It is easier for them to plunder the countryside with the help of the collective farm system. In many occupied districts, people have already figured this out." "Is it true that the Germans are exporting black earth from the Ukraine back to Germany?" "I don't know, but I admit that the Germans are capable of something like that." "Tell me, Comrade Commissar, the People's Commissar of Defence promised that the war would end this year, but we're nowhere near that." "That just means that so far we are not fighting well. The better we learn how to strike the enemy, the sooner we'll chase him from our land." "There are painful delays with the mail." "I know, we're taking measures. If only we could bathe more often. It's a barrier against fleas." "We've made a steam bathhouse for each battalion, so get your birch twigs ready." It is common practice for Russians to lash themselves with a bundle of twigs while taking a sauna. "It seems, Comrade Commissar, that the Germans have reopened the churches in the villages. What are we supposed to make of this?" "The occupiers are dulling people's senses, so they entice them into churches. They want to make the people more obedient." Later, we spent more than an hour in my dugout. To the question, how could I explain that there had been no attempts to desert in my company, I told him about my system and highly praised my men. "What were you doing before the war?" "I finished my schooling in 1941, but in 1937 I worked as an assistant in a movie theatre. I had to earn the keep for the family after my mother lost her job." "Was this while your father was in prison?" "Yes, fortunately he returned. Now he's directing a defence facility in the Urals." "Tell me, what's your nationality?" he asked suddenly. "A Jew? Excuse me, if it's no secret, does this have some significance to you personally?" "You've guessed it, Lieutenant. This does have personal significance. By conviction and conduct, I am an internationalist. My grandfather and father raised me to be this way. I myself am from Yaroslavl. Before the revolution, Jews didn't live in our city. But no matter how strangely, our first Red Commandant of the city was the former city cobbler, the only Jew in Yaroslavl. It turned out that he had been a secret member of the Bolshevik Party. He was killed during the Socialist Revolutionary Rebellion in 1918. Now let me speak a little more concretely about why I asked you about your nationality. Unfortunately, both in the division and higher up, there are commanders and political workers who don't treat Jews in a very friendly fashion. They consider Jews to be cowardly, crafty, and bad soldiers. I disagree, and in my political department, I put an end to such attitudes. You are one of the arguments in my favour. What do you think, Lieutenant, are the main reasons for desertion? Can I speak openly, Comrade Colonel Commissar? Only openly? What kind of sense would our talk have otherwise? I've thought about this matter more than once. I can name two reasons. First are the continuous failures of the army around Rzhev and the enormous human losses. People want no part of senseless butchery. The second reason is the soldier's hard life. How long can a person labour when he sees no concrete concern for his well-being from his higher-ups, especially when the aroma of tasty food wafts over to us from the German lines? Borisov was silent for a bit, wiping his glasses, then thanked me for the useful conversation and left the company area. Division Commander Poplavsky and officers. Soon after Borisov's visit, the division commander summoned all his battalion and company commanders to his headquarters. It was the first time I ever saw General Poplavsky. It had been said in the ranks that the general was a puny guy, but I saw that he was a muscular man. He was pug-nosed. He was wearing a brand-new leather jacket. He spoke sharply, in clipped phrases. His declarations crackled with energy, and it seemed as if every statement produced a new eruption of sparks. I will no longer tolerate desertions in my division. We must increase our vigilance, first of all among ourselves. I will be punishing commanders even more harshly for anyone going over to the Germans. One battalion commander leapt to his feet. They're fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. For this incautious outburst, the battalion commander left the meeting as a company commander. He had only been a battalion commander for a month. You had to watch your step around a man like Poplavsky. Later we found out that they slapped a formal party rebuke on the guilty man for political immaturity. Commissar Borisov spoke. We, commanders and commissars, are doing a poor job with the ideological education of the soldiers. As a result, people have no confidence in victory over the fascists. Company commanders are not carrying out their basic duties, show little concern for the welfare of their subordinates, and some soldiers, especially from the southern regions of the country, are not enduring the hard life on the front lines. We all need to think about what we can do for them. We also ought to consider that a portion of our men come from recently liberated areas. They want to go home. The farther the army advances to the west, the more this tendency, this longing for home, will grow. You can also find unstable people in the ranks, and possibly even unexposed accomplices of the fascists. In conclusion, the division commissar mentioned my name and told everyone about the experience of work with subordinates in my company. He even devised a name for my system, Not a Step Forward, by analogy with Order number 227, Not a Step Backward. I will not hide that I was flattered. But a comment, deliberately and loudly tossed out from somewhere among the gathered officers, quickly spoiled my mood. Of course, the cunning Jew has pulled the wool over all our eyes. We're all just a bunch of idiots, while he's the favourite. I was highly offended and almost lost my composure, but I held my tongue. What a cheap shot. I wasn't doing this to help myself, but for the good of the army. The meeting ended and we began to disperse. The chief of the division's special department stopped me as I was leaving and introduced himself. Major Kovalev. He politely asked me to hold up for a bit. Once we were alone, he asked me, "Do you know about the group of young Ukrainian soldiers? There are 8 of them in your company." "I know," I answered. But how they wound up in Kazakhstan, I don't know. These are kids of parents who had been exiled to Kazakhstan for being unreliable elements during the struggle against the kulaks in the Ukraine in the 1930s. For a long time, they wouldn't take such youth into the army, but now, apparently, they consider them to be okay. But whether or not we can trust them, I'm not sure. I believe in them. I've talked with each of them. They're all happy to be fighting against the Germans, and they hope after the war to return to the Ukraine. You seem very sure, Lieutenant. They're new recruits, and they were poorly prepared, but that's not their fault, so I'm bringing them up to speed. Just see to it that you're not mistaken. Misplaced trust can cost you dearly. I ask you personally to keep me informed about the slightest hint of problems. On this, the conversation ended, and I headed back to my company. Back at the company, something rather unpleasant was waiting for me. An agitated Oleg, the company's Komsomol organizer, had been marking time by my dugout, waiting for my return. He was holding a couple of German magazines with lurid colour illustrations excitedly. "The fools! Look what they've thought up now. They're tempting our brother with pictures of naked ladies." "Oleg," I cut in, "you haven't looked at any of this fascist filth, have you? You've done the right thing by collecting them and bringing them to me. Of course you've brought them to be burned, haven't you? That's what we're going to do?" I gazed at him intently. The young soldier answered instantly, his brain working furiously. "Of course, I always counsel my Komsomol members to behave this way." I tore up both magazines in front of Oleg's eyes. Then we both stepped into the dugout, and the stove flared as I tossed the material into it. I gave one scrap to my radio operator, who also tossed this trash into the fire. After Oleg left, I started pondering a different matter. What could I tell my soldiers about the Allies and the Second Front? They had been constantly asking me about it. We never knew what was going on above us, or about the diplomatic struggles that were unfolding between Stalin and the Allies on the subject of opening a second front. We most often learned about all this from the Germans, of course with a certain amount of outright lying. In 1942, and even in 1943, they had been printing and scattering leaflets over our lines about the disagreements between Stalin and Churchill. At the beginning of 1944, they tried to convince us that the Allies had tricked us, and that there would be no second front in the West. The swine directly wrote, "The Allies have fooled Stalin." We never received any official announcements about the scale of the Allies' military and material assistance to the Soviet Union. How did the commanders and we, the soldiers, react to the delays in opening a second front? Gradually, a misunderstanding of what was happening, and even a sense of distrust toward our allies, developed. A simple and understandable thought gathered in all our minds. Every delay in opening the second front only protracted the war, which meant more casualties. The Red Army was bleeding, while the Allies only shared new promises, meat stew, and army boots with us. The frontline press and our commissars cultivated this mood among the men, as only they were able. Here is an example from the Army's newspaper. Two soldiers are having a conversation. One asks, "How can a second front in the West be opened more quickly?" The other replies, "At least the American boots will be helpful to us in reaching it more quickly." But then American tanks, airplanes, and the famous Studebaker and Dodge trucks and Willys jeeps began appearing at the front. The day of the Allied landing on the beaches of Normandy, the 6th of June, 1944, was celebrated far and wide among the frontline soldiers of the Red Army. A multitude of jokes and nicknames about the Second Front circulated among the soldiers. For example, cans of American stew were called Second Front. Whenever anyone was preparing to open some cans, someone would exclaim without fail, "Open a second front!" The English Matilda tank, designated to play an infantry support role, was known among the men as the Crazy Wench. The Studebaker truck, or the Studera as the soldiers called it, which fundamentally improved the mobility of Soviet infantry and artillery, was affectionately known as the Breezy Fellow. The soldiers gave affectionate diminutive names to other armoured vehicles. Thus, the British Valentine tank became the Valentin, and the Bantam BRC-40 Jeep was called the Bantique, Little Bow. Whenever American Lend-Lease Bell Airacobra fighters appeared in the skies overhead, the soldiers would tightly clench their fists, tip back their heads, and joyfully cry, "Come on, guys! Give the Germans some stronger venom!" One of the soldiers, gazing up at the American fighter planes in the sky, said that our best fighter pilots flew in the Airacobra. This was the truth. From the summer of 1942 until the end of the war, the famous Soviet ace Alexander Pokrishkin flew the Bell Airacobra. Our pilots appreciated its toughness and armament, and it flew reasonably well at the lower altitudes that prevailed in the dogfighting on the Eastern Front.